All right, Guru Nation. I went ahead and took one for the team, and I listened to Megyn Kelly's hour-long podcast with the new FDA head, Dr. Marty Makary. I also have his book on Q on both Audible and Kindle, so I can get through it quickly and give you my thoughts on Makary's book and his thought process. I think it's important to do this because rather than politicizing something like the FDA, which politics should not be anywhere near the FDA, food and drug safety should not be in the same sentence as politics. And unfortunately, it is. And I think it's important to figure out the thought process of who's in charge for ourselves. Interview was on X, but I listened to it on Spotify. It happened April 17th. I wanted to get his thought process. A lot of it was related to food. And so if you want to listen to the whole thing, I'll put the link underneath this video. Um, Obviously, the parts that I care about, yes, there are some places where food and research, particularly nutraceutical, I do think that is going to make a comeback, and I will get to it in this video. Also, I have a 10-part series of how we're in the golden era of clinical research sites. I actually think, in a strange way, we might be in the golden era for biotech. And maybe not all, but I think rare disease biotech should be incentivized to do more. So you can argue that maybe the same rare disease sites will just have double the work from double the sponsors as opposed to doing phase two and phase three. We'll get into that. Who is Dr. Marty Makary? So he's definitely well accomplished. Chief of transplant surgery at Johns Hopkins, public health researcher, author of Blind Spots. This is the book that I have on queue. Blind Spots: When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. So he developed the World Health Organization's surgical safety checklist and critiques medical groupthink. One of his quotes was, "Medical groupthink and medicine's hyperspecialization approach to sickness has resulted in giant blind spots." Uh, so this encourages researchers, if you listen to this whole interview, challenge the dominant paradigms such as genetics-focused research. The more recent ones have been the mRNA-focused research. Maybe those two are the same things. Even that is a fight not worth having right now. So, confirmed just recently, he wants to reduce conflicts of interest. He wants to rebuild public trust. He really wants to focus on the F in the FDA, just like the RFK Jr. Uh, he has concerns about research integrity. So one of his quotes was, recently, Dr. John Carlisle examined 500 clinical trials and found that a whopping 44% of them contained false data. So this signals potential scrutiny on data quality in NIH and FDA submissions. And the majority of that was in academic medical research. And specifically in the early stage, like at the AMC level, there was an article way before all this happened, too, a year ago, where I actually did a video on academia's not without its own data integrity issues. He also discusses, like, he said that this is a free country, so when it comes to regulatory capture, we can't outlaw somebody who works for the FDA to then go work for the pharmaceuticals. He did say that you don't have to worry about him doing that. He has no interest in that. He might want to work with some scientists, some inventors at the very early stage of biotechs, it sounds like, but definitely not. He's not the type for big pharma, but he can't, his hands are tied in that regard as far as regulatory capture. But at least removing pharma from the AdCom meetings, I think that was a big deal, and replace them with patient advocates and community at resource and just like patient centric. This whole push for patient centricity. He discusses. And I'm just giving you guys highlights because I don't want to make this longer than the actual podcast itself. The NIH, National Institute of Health, historical obsession with genetics. So it started from the 1970s. The NIH has prioritized genetics in autism and just about every condition where they can get funding. They've done genetics research. And he uses the example of obesity because this is what's hot right now. And he's saying, uh, there's funding that has been cut, and he discusses some of the NIH cuts. He discusses the FDA cuts too. I'm going to get back to, but regarding genetics, he says, there's nothing wrong. There's value in finding information about genetics, and in the last decade, that genetics research started getting into the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation where researchers were trying to find, like, for example, with obesity, why certain people, certain races, ethnicities get are higher like are have a bigger likelihood of getting obesity than others. And he specifically used the example of African Americans, Latin Americans. And he said, you know what, there's value in that, but the much more common sense approach and the more holistic approach is to look at what we're eating, to look at the F in the FDA, to look at the food industry's push for, and he even said this quote, I believe, from the podcast. It might not be exactly the quote, but he told Megyn, the food industry guys, these are not bad people. All they did was do what we wanted them to do. We asked them to produce food that was cheap at scale, and that's what they did. And now we're dealing with the consequences because obesity, and I've talked about this on my podcast before when there's overlap between clinical research and public health. I've interviewed people on discussing this very thing. I don't think he's saying anything that anyone disagrees with. In lower income communities, there is a higher prevalence of obesity and other comorbidities, specifically because it's easier to get unhealthy food and it's more difficult to get healthy food, mainly because of economics. It's cheaper to get unhealthy food. And that's what the food industry did. He says there's not some evil plot. It's just we got what we asked for. So for the NIH to focus so much on genetic disparities as opposed to just looking at the source of what's caused the root cause, he said. And he said he doesn't think there's going to be any more cuts at the NIH or the FDA. And he said he wants to invest a lot of the public money, and he's already talking to the NIH, the new leadership, about nutraceutical studies. And so I think for us research sites and people in the industry, you can expect some nutraceutical trials, some more nutraceutical trials. In my entire 20 years, I've only done one nutraceutical study, and I've always been intrigued by them. So there might be more nutraceutical trials coming. He also talked about autism, and he said, contrary to popular belief and what the media might think about me and RFK, who's his boss, with the HHS, we do not attribute autism to vaccines. We attribute autism to a whole wide variety of causes, namely environmental, namely what we're putting in our bodies, namely he discussed seed oils and food dyes and carbs, and he said those are really what we're looking at, while the media wants to take on this whole notion of, we're anti-vax, which we're not. He says this focus on genetics is very costly, and not that it's not important, but we need to be looking at environmental factors like diet, and we're going to be pushing for a broader approach. And his quote here was, the vaccine autism link has been thoroughly debunked through some of the largest and most comprehensive psychiatric epidemiological studies ever performed. So this is debunking the vaccine links. The NIH sidelined other environmental factors. They are going to be looking at them again. Now, back to the FDA. He did discuss how the headlines were sensationalized. So from 2006 till 2024, the FDA had a 100% increase in their employees. And so he believes a lot of that was excessive, and the cuts that the FDA that were made at the FDA, no reviewer were cut. No, so no scientific reviewers. So everyone worrying about, oh, it's going to take forever to get drugs approved. No, he even said no reviewers were touched. No scientific reviewers, no auditors were cut. All the cuts happened more in administrative roles and information technology, and he what he called, a lot of redundancy in these roles. So we actually want to decrease the timelines for approval. We need to take that 10-year timeline of approval down. And he also wants to reduce the need for animal testing, because he says animals were not made, his quote, animals were not made for us to experiment on. Now, he also discussed the food pyramid. So he critiques the food pyramid, arguing it promotes diets high in processed carbs and low in nutrient dense foods, potentially contributing to the health. Now, I think nutraceuticals are gonna be a lot of them going on. I do think vaccines are not going away. He even said in this interview, what RFK wants to do is look at the vaccines, and any new vaccines we will require placebo controlled. Uh, there are other potential research areas here too. So, pesticide-laden foods, redoing the food pyramid. Now, back to the removing pharma from FDA AdCom meetings. So he announced the removal of the representatives from FDA AdCom meetings for industry representatives from pharma companies, replacing them with patient advocates and caregivers. His quote, "We need to restore impeccable integrity to the process and avoid potential conflicts of interest." He also said industry employees are welcome to attend the FDA AdCom meetings, but having industry employees serve as official members represents a cozy relationship that is concerning. Now, this reduced industry influence may lead to more patient-centric drug approvals, potentially prioritizing rare disease drugs. He said he wants to use a lot of real-world evidence that's de-identified when it comes to rare drug approval. So he used the example, if there's a rare disease where there's only like 45 kids in the United States that have it, why are we requiring two double-blind studies? Let's have one, let's approve it, and then let's use the real world evidence from the EMRs, de-identified, to look at the safety, the long-term safety. So there was a lot more clarification around rare disease. I think rare disease sites might be temporarily slower, but I do think this incentivizes, and he even said, what we want to do is incentivize more rare disease research, not drive it down. Now, if that actually happens, not sure, but certainly sponsors would love that idea of only having to do one clinical trial as opposed to two. And so between that, the autism, the obesity, the food, he kind of debunked the FDA cuts. I know a lot of people, I'm on X and I'm a biotech investor myself. A lot of people are upset. And there's different kinds of biotechs too, right? There's the CRISPR genetic editing stuff, which it seems like maybe there's some resistance towards further experimentation into gene editing, especially with the new CBER head that was announced today, Dr. Prasad. I'm trying to have him on the show as well. It's the one that's in charge of biologics and these CRISPR type of stocks. So CRISPR is the gene editing stuff. Jennifer Doudna, I actually have her book right here. amazing. And there's still a lot of potential in that. But I think there is gonna be a slight shift in as far as where the research money goes over the next decade. I think obesity is gonna continue. I think asthma, psych. I think what might be in trouble are I don't even think rare disease is going to be in trouble because in theory it's going to expedite more. But I think where there's going to be a gap where there's not a lot of rare disease research, and then we'll pick it back up. And I think the genetic editing stuff, as promising as it is, I'm an investor myself. I think that is a very long-term thing. I think you're going to have to show a lot of due diligence when you are coming out with gene editing for something where there is, I think Dr. Prasad, and I know we're getting sidetracked, when he was mentioning why do gene editing for something where we have medications to deliver. And there's a whole argument. I'd like to get him on the show for this. But as far as Makary, I think ultimately, while he's definitely anti-establishment, I mean, he even basically says it himself. No reviewers or inspectors were laid off as part of the Doge cuts. In his quote, even if no direct cuts were made to scientists and inspectors, it's misleading to suggest that this wouldn't affect the overall operations at the FDA. But at least the public is more aware of it now, which is maybe a win in and of itself. And maybe there's some public trust that can be won back. His own words. Um, I'll end this with a quote, or maybe by Dr. Makary from the interview. More doctors are refusing to kiss the ring of the medical oligarchs and instead are teaming up with creative people to redesign medical care. So maybe the relevance here is this inspires researchers to innovate more and maybe shift the paradigm. I don't think any of the big stuff's changing, like GLPs, all that stuff's going to continue. But I do think we're going to see more food related stuff, especially for autism and neurodevelopment, more obesity studies, more comorbidities. We've got an entire lifetime to fix the epidemic that we're in as far as obesity and even autism, which is now, I think, in California, 1 out of 22 kids have it. I'm going to read the book. I'm going to give you my opinion on the book, but from what I've listened to in this Megyn Kelly interview, I think there's some pros and cons. I think if you're in the genetic research side of things, might be tough, facing a lot of headwinds. But if you're on like comorbidity kind of research, chronic disease, I think it's business as usual. It's just supposedly gonna get accelerated drug approvals, and we'll see. We'll see. And I think the vaccines, interestingly enough, remain unchanged, other than, if anything, making them more stringent and one with the placebo controlled. And one last thing, he used an example from Purdue Pharma with the opioid crisis, opioid epidemic that we had last decade, where really the public's trust in pharma and regulators kind of started getting exposed, and then COVID just kind of blew it open. He said it's unacceptable when the with a to have an indication like chronic pain where you only have a 14-day study with no long-term effects, and then you're prescribing this to like out on an outpatient basis when it was never meant to be on an outpatient basis. It was meant to be under strict supervision or an inpatient facility. So I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny when it comes to how cozy industry and regulators are. I think ultimately we're in the golden era of research for research sites, and we're in the golden era of research for biotechs. It might be scary times for some of them, gene editing especially. If you feel like watching Megyn Kellen's pod, click the link below, check it out. Like, subscribe, comment, share, let me know what you think. Bye bye.